Hi, I'm going to go ahead and continue the discussion on biochemistry. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are probably one of the most important resources for fuel and energy in our body. They are part of so many processes in our body, including glycolysis and many other processes like citric acid cycle. The brain really runs on carbohydrates a lot, so we're going to be talking about them today. So I'm going to start off with the nomenclature in this video. So many carbohydrates, they can be are monosaccharides, meaning that they're the most simplest forms, and you usually just number them based on the number of carbons that you see in the structure. So if you just have 3 carbons, it's going to be called a triose. If you see 4 carbons, it's going to be called a tetrose. A pentose is a sugar with 5 carbons, and a hexose is a carbon with a carbohydrate with 6 carbons. So carbohydrates can be classified broadly into 2 groups, which are aldoses and ketoses. Aldoses are carbohydrates that have an aldehyde group as their most oxidized functional group, and I did draw out a little structure up there, so it's a C double bond O to an H. Then you have ketoses, in which the most oxidized form, the most oxidized functional group is a ketone group, and I did kind of draw that out too. So based off of whether your functional group, which is basically the number 1 carbon in aldoses and the number 2 carbon in ketoses, you determine the kind of the prefix of the nomenclature that I'll describe in a couple of minutes, or right now. So when you're trying to name carbohydrates, what you do is you combine the number of carbons with the functional group. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to look at the functional group. Like I said, you would look at either carbon 1 if it's aldose or carbon 2 if it's a ketose. I would look at it and I would see if I have a C double bonded O and then an H, or if I just have a C double bond O and the carbon being bonded to other R groups or carbon groups, so it doesn't have any hydrogen if it's a ketose. So based off of that, I would determine if it's an aldo or a ketone. Then I would count the number of carbons. So if it's 3, I'm going to say it's a triose, and I'll go from there. So if I have a functional group, for example, down here, and I drew the most basic structure of aldehyde, and I'm going to use this as an example for understanding the nomenclature and how you would name sugars if you ever had to do so on a test or in school or on assignments. So what I do first is I look at the carbon and see if it is an aldose or ketose. So over here I see that the carbon is bonded to a double bond O and then an H. This matches up with your aldehyde group up here. So this would be called an aldo. And then now you count the number of carbons in here. So since there's 1, 2, and 3, it would be a triose. So when you combine it together, it would be an aldo triose. Aldo because you have an aldehyde group, and triose because you have 3 carbons. Similarly, if I were to talk about a ketose, I would do the same thing. I would look at a carbon in the center, or at number 1 or number 2, and see if it's attached to 2 other groups. In that case, it would be a ketose. And then I would count the number of carbons in here. And in this case, we have 3 carbons, 1, 2, 3. This bond is just representing this carbon being bonded to the OH group, and since we just have 3 carbons, it's called the keto triose. These 2 are basically the most basic forms of aldoses and ketoses. They're called a glyceraldehyde, and then this one is a dihydroxyacetone. I'm gonna write that out real quick so you have it for your notes. So the simplest form of a ketotriose, or ketotriose is also called dihydroxyacetone. So these are the most simplest forms of the sugar. Now going on to connectivity, 2 sugars can be linked by a glycosidic linkage, which is basically when 2 sugars come together and then they undergo a reaction where they're combined, and at that point it is no longer a monosaccharide. You will be terming it as a disaccharide or a trisaccharide, and based off of how many you have, you can use other suffixes like polysaccharide for many and algio for like small sugars, and you go from there. So just remember that by itself, each residue of a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide, and then the more you add on, you're going to be calling them a disaccharide or trisaccharide, and then I guess after that point you just use the terms poly or oligo, and I will spell those out for you. So you have your polysaccharides, and then you have your oligosaccharides. And if I'm pretty sure that poly is more than 20, and then oligo is less than 20, but I will make a correction if necessary in the next video on that. So this is what the introduction to carbohydrates looks like.